name is Jeffrey King Holmes, and my brother Blaine Keith Holmes and I are the only children of Lester Leroy Holmes and Frances Madeline Merrill. I was born in 1946, my brother in 51. My brother is a single gentleman. I am married to Ardeth Emerson, and we raised no children. Blaine has no children, so this will be the end of the family line in the immediate area, and we are the seventh generation. So on the home side, we have a long history and a well-documented history due to the diligence and studiousness of a fifth-generation cousin whom I've never met, Theodore Crozier Holmes, who produced a beautiful volume on the Holmes family. I have a copy. There's also one in the archives, if Charlotte County Archives, if anyone should wish to pursue information on the Holmes family. We have no idea where the name King came from. Of course, that's my middle name because I was named after him.
Did the King name go further back, or?
We don't know. I have not seen it anywhere.
Just sprang up.
Just sprang up. It goes John, Thomas, William, Theodore, Horace, Lester, our dad, and then Blaine and I. The first generation, John. The story is that he was an Irish kid from Killarney who was indentured to a trade he didn't like. So he jumped on a ship and sailed to North America. And he put ashore in Machiasport, Maine, married a girl from Pleasant River, Maine. They almost immediately moved to Beaver Harbour. He moved to Canada in 1800. Once again, I think the border was incidental in those days. I don't know that they even took out different citizenship, but he moved with his wife to Beaver Harbour, and that's where he started raising this 7 generations, many of whom had large families. I think he's buried in Penfield, if I'm not mistaken. He retired to Penfield to live with a daughter in his very late years. William was a third generation. Thomas, his dad, raised that family on Deer Island. And as I said, the boys and some of the girls went to the United States, but it was the 4 boys who became prominent in the sardine industry. Thomas, in Thomas's obituary, the dad, it said he was a master mariner and prominent in the fishing industry. So it's interesting that all of those fishermen and prominent people in the sardine industry in my ancestry, but that seemed to cease at grandfather Horace's generation, because to my knowledge, he never went to sea, and my father never went to sea, and I certainly haven't. Grand Manan Ferry is the only seagoing I've done in recent years. But I guess grandfather Horace and my dad were landlubbers, and they weren't entrepreneurial. My dad was never in business for himself. Horace wasn't, to my knowledge, yet all those previous generations were, and largely, I mean, they were not incidental business people. And William and his 4 brothers were pioneers in the sardine industry, having grown up in, I guess it's on Deer Island, not in Deer Island, having grown up on Deer Island. 4 of that family of 11, the 4 boys, moved to Eastport. 3 of them established themselves in the sardine industry immediately. And we're told that William, my great-great-grandfather, had a career as a sea captain and then got in the sardine business later in life. He and his brothers at one time owned 5 sardine canneries in Eastport, and they owned others in Perry and Robinson and possibly here in St Andrews, but they were documented to have owned 5 in Eastport at one time. There were 15 sardine plants in Eastport in 1881. It was around 1850s when they first started canning sardines, getting away from smoked fish and into canned fish, when canning techniques were improved and pasteurization may not have been called that in those days, but when they learned how to sterilize the cans and the canning equipment and so on, the demand for sardines was huge. So the demand for sardines meant there was a great work for the fishermen. In 1893, there were 240 weirs in Passamaquoddy Bay. I don't know if there's one in the bay now. I can't recall where I can see one from the shore. There may be some out around the islands, but imagine 240 weirs, and those weirs served the factories up and down the coast. And of course, in those days, the border was more or less irrelevant. I believe they could sell their fish wherever they could get the best price, or whoever they were indebted to, because often the factories would loan money to the fishermen to build their weirs and buy their boats, with the understanding that they had to supply that particular factory. I took note in John Gilman's book on the sardine industry, which I have here. If anyone's interested in the sardine industry, this is the book to acquire and read. I think they're still available at La Baleine Boutique. John grew up in Oak Bay, and his dad was a weir fisherman. He has documented it amazingly well. But a couple of items that I came across in his book that I thought were of interest. In 1899, great-great-grandfather William sold one of his factories to the Continental Can Company in Eastport for $22,000 US. A quick look at Google suggests that was that'd be about $500,000 today. And there's another notation where one of the other brothers sold his factory for $33,000. So that seemed to be the going rate. But something of particular interest to me, because my hobby is railroading, and I'm aware that there was a rail line going into Eastport. In fact, there's been talk over recent years of trying to rehabilitate that, because of the port in Eastport is becoming more active, that they would like to revitalize the old rail connection. But I learned in John Gilman's book that when the railway was opened in 1899, the first load of freight to be transported over the rail was a load of box shooks from Princeton, Maine, to the M.C. Holmes canning plant in Eastport. So my great-great-grandfather's brother was the recipient of the first load of material that came over that line.
How come you got interested in railways?
Always had an interest in railways. I don't know where it came from. I wish I had paid more attention when I was very young, when we still had rail coming in here. I didn't develop an interest, I guess, until I was probably in my 20s or 30s. So I don't want to go on forever about the sardine industry, but certainly that generation of my family, the first, second, third, Thomas, John, William, that third generation played a prominent role. In fact, I'd like to read you something that was in the Quoddy Tides newspaper a number of years ago. It says, perhaps no family has contributed more to the industrial life of Eastport, and perhaps none has been more successful in business than the sons of Thomas Holmes, Captain Thomas Holmes. I don't know where the wealth went. It didn't trickle down to me. They all raised big families. And in that book of Theodore's, they went to the best schools. Several of them graduated from MIT. Some were Harvard graduates. There were doctors and lawyers and professionals all amongst them. And the last generation to practice medicine around here, I believe, was a Dr. Holmes in Calais, in my memory. So Theodore was I think, a serial entrepreneur. He was a builder. He was a boat builder. He was a fisherman. He had a small sardine packing plant here in St Andrews, and he had a herring weir, or possibly more than one at one time. And he was a boat builder, and he and his brother-in-law, Rufus Calder from Deer Island, built a pinky schooner, which was a sardine carrier. And on the American coast, they call them a carryaway boat. We always, on this coast, call them a sardine carrier. I believe she's 42 feet long, has quite a wide beam, and she was powered largely by sail, although she had a small auxiliary motor at one time. I don't know whether the motor was in her originally or came later, but she was built to service Theodore's weirs and the sardine factory he owned in Robbinston, Maine. So he had his own vessel to carry the sardines from his weir to his factory. I have a picture of me standing on the deck of the Regina M, which is the boat that Theodore and Rufus built. She is in the permanent collection at the Mystic Seaport Museum. His dad was one of 12 children, and he was the youngest. His father was Horace Henry Holmes, and Horace Henry was married to Barbara Jane Johnson from Johnson Settlement, which is in the Digdigwash River Basin. And they got together, we believe, when she came to work in St Andrews at the Lansdowne Hotel that was owned by great-grandfather Theodore. She met the owner's son, and they ended up marrying and raising a big family. The Lansdowne Hotel was in the corner of Princess Royal and Water. It's the lot presently being developed as looks like a garden cafe associated with Drew Haven, the organization that's taken over what we knew as the Masonic Hall. So on that lot was a rather imposing hotel. It looked very much like the Windsor Arms, and grandfather owned it for around 10 years. It was known by various names over the years, but during his ownership, it was Lansdowne. Grandfather, Boyd King Merrill, was brought up on a farm outside St. Stephen in an area called De Wolf. And as a young man, he worked on farms. He worked in the lumber woods. He went out west on the harvest trains when times were tough. Young men from this area did that to make money. And I recall him telling me he went with a contingent of lumbermen out to harvest wood on the Wolves one winter. And he said he'd never been in a more desolate, colder place than working out on the Wolves in the winter. And they rafted the logs they harvested and towed them to St. Stephen. They had a powerboat, obviously, that towed the rafts of logs into St. Stephen. But of course, the Wolves had never been lumbered. They'd never been cut. So it was all virgin wood out there. So that was one of the interesting things he told me about his past. His parents were Martin and Helen Merrill. They're buried in St. Stephen Cemetery. And we understand the original Merrills were French Huguenots. He always said persecuted French Huguenots who moved to England and then to Newburyport, Massachusetts. They immigrated from Newburyport. They got well established in Newburyport. There's quite a story about their years in Newburyport or the generation in Newburyport. Made quite a contribution to that community. And then one faction of the Merrill family moved here to Charlotte County and began farming out in the De Wolf area beyond St. Stephen. He was quite influential in my life. Number one, because my grandfather Horace Holmes died quite young. I didn't die before I was born, so I didn't meet him. And grandmother Barbara Holmes died when I was very young. So I have some memories of her, but didn't get to know her really well. So the Merrills, Boyd and Helen Merrill, had quite an influence on our upbringing. Typically, grandparents sometimes had more time for children than busy parents. And I recall our spending a lot of time with them. We only lived a few doors away on Reed Avenue, so it was an easy hike, even when you're very small children. In those days, you were allowed to go on your own a few doors down the street. So I was brought up in two generations of family that were very civic-minded. Grandfather Merrill was a town councillor. He was a county councillor at one time. He was a tax assessor, which was an appointed position at one time. And he was very active in the Boy Scout Association. In fact, he got an honorary life membership in the Boy Scout Association. And he and his wife, Helen, and some other people in the community started Charlotte County Cancer. And that organization, founded by my grandparents and others, has played a significant role in this community, helping people who fall through the cracks. There are people who are receiving cancer treatment, and they need travel, or they need dressings, or they need prosthesis, things that Medicare doesn't cover, and if they're uninsured or underinsured, aren't provided with. So that's that makes me very proud to think of all the good work that organization has done over, more than 50 years now, since it was founded. My brother Blaine is currently the president of that organization. I believe the family has had an unbroken connection to that organization since its founding. So after the war, he started his own business on Douglas Street, St Andrews Woollen's Hand Weaving. And it was always referred to as a woolen mill, but in fact, it was a hand weaving mill. The yarn was already spun and dyed and ready to go on the looms when he purchased it from Briggs & Little's woolen mill in Harvey Station. So we had several weavers on the second floor, had a retail outlet on the front of the ground floor, and a processing plant in the back on the ground floor. And my job, starting when I was about 13 as a student working in the summer after school, was sometimes on the counter, sometimes waiting on customers, or I could be in the processing plant out back where all the material had to be washed and dried and pressed and processed before it could go on the shelf. So I worked there until 1972, when I crossed the street to start operating HMS Transportation. And my brother took over at that point, and that business lasted quite a while longer. But fashions change, and how many men do you see in a tweed jacket these days? And how many young women do you see in matching skirt and sweater outfits, which were the big sellers in the 60s and 70s, and maybe even into the early 80s. So unfortunately, the business eventually, as cottagecraft did, just seemed to lose its role in the marketplace. But my brother Blaine is quite artistic in that, sort of a fabric artist. I don't think he ever did any art on canvas, as was our grandfather Boyd. Boyd had a great eye for color, and he claimed to have originated a lot of the cottagecraft colors that sort of became public property over the years. Everyone used them. The Fundy Fog and the Quaddy Blue and the...
Did your dad work in the woolen mill?
Well, he did, when time permitted. He was not a full-time employee there during my memories, but he would often go in the evening, and there was a large loom upstairs that took quite a lot of muscle to operate, and not to suggest the women couldn't do it, but they didn't like operating it. And Dad would go in the evenings and weave blankets on that big loom, and some of which we still have. We treasure them, of course. And that was sort of his contribution to the operation. And he was quite mechanically inclined. If anything broke down or needed repair, he was the one we would call on to help us make the repairs. In my early days there, we fired the boiler with coal. We required a lot of hot water and a lot of steam to run the steam mangle and so on. And we fired with coal. And the old boiler had no safety devices on it like a modern boiler would. And it was not unusual to build up too much pressure and hear the safety blow off and the boiler didn't have a water injector. It relied on the town water pressure to feed it. Now on Water Street, that's not so bad because the pressure was around 100 pounds per square inch. But occasionally I'd be operating the boiler and get sidetracked, and the pressure would go up, and the pressure in the boiler would overtake the municipal pressure, and the neighbors would get steam in their bathroom basins and toilets. Something like that could happen today. There would be so many safety devices on to prevent that from happening, which there weren't in those days.
And where did your coal come from in those days? It came in by train still?
I believe at that time it was by train. Although I have a faint memory of a coal vessel coming into Finnegan's Wharf, which was behind a harborfront restaurant. I don't think I dreamed that, Franklin. I think I remember a vessel coming in there when I was very, very young. It would have thereafter come by train. And Mr. Finnegan was the coal merchant.
We have a picture of him playing golf.
Mm-hmm.
1939. We have a video of him, actually.
Well, he was quite prominent in the community.
Hmm.
My mom was Frances Madeline Merrill.
Did she work in the wool mill at all?
She did. Again, I don't know that she ever had full-time work there, but she would go in and weave if we were shorthanded, or certainly she worked on the counter. I recall her working some weekend shifts and so on there. The weaving part was interesting. During my time, we generally had 3, sometimes 4 weavers upstairs, and they were paid piecework. So there was a competition amongst them as to who could put out more yardage in the run of a day. And of course, quality was an issue as well. Who could put out the best looking product? And if you can imagine throwing a shuttle to and fro all day long, one little thread at a time, those ladies sometimes would weave over 20 yards in a day. And how many threads would there be in a yard? How many tosses of that shuttle? And I don't recall them working really long days. I mean, most of them had families, so they came in after they had their kids off to school and were home by 5 o'clock to get their husband's dinner in those days, but they produced a monumental amount of material. Yeah, so that business flourished and provided them with a good income for a good many years. But at the same time, grandmother Helen, who was also very civic minded, she was involved in a lot of community efforts. And I remember how proud she was when she was elected president of the Canadian Club, which was quite an influential organization in those days. But she ran cabins and a tourist home on Reed Avenue. When they bought the property, there were 2 cabins. They built 2 more, and they also had 2 rooms in the house that they rented. And cabins were the popular accommodation before motels. Sometimes they were called tourist camps in New Brunswick, but they always referred to theirs as Merrill's cabins and rooms, guest house or tourist house. I'm sure, I forget which label they put on it. And that was grandmother's income, and she was very good at it. She was a very good hostess, and she had customers come back year after year after year. And she and grandfather were great bridge players. Those were the days before much television and much canned entertainment. And they would register a couple in one of their cabins, for instance, and they sort of size them up and say, well, there's a couple traveling without kids, they're our age. Do you play bridge? And if they said they did, then there was a bridge game set up for later that same evening, and they'd become friends for life. Grandfather Merrill was a founding member of the Charlotte County Board of Trade and the St Andrews Chamber of Commerce, which had previously been known as the St Andrews Businessmen's Association. It evolved from being the Businessmen's Association to being the Chamber of Commerce in 1967. And I think it would have pleased him to know that in subsequent decades, both Blaine and I were at times president of that organization, and that organization is ever strong and representing about 140 businesses in the St Andrews area. The Board of Trade, the Charlotte County Board of Trade, no longer exists, but the Chamber of Commerce is very strong in representing our community. I might make one comment. When we talked about nicknames, and people who had nicknames, the only person I created a nickname for was my grandfather, Merrill. When I was born, I was the first grandchild and the only grandchild for the first 5 years. So I was lavished with attention. He loved to read to me. And of course, as a little boy, I loved the comic strips. And one of my favorites was Little Abner. And the Little Abner comic strip, the patriarch of that family was Pappy Yoakum. And somehow I decided that I would thereafter refer to my grandfather as Pappy. And as a result of that, a whole generation of young people in St Andrews and some of his peers and many of his employees ever after referred to him as Pappy Merrill. And he welcomed that. He thought it was great to have that nickname. The story I want to share with you about my grandmother, in the 1950s, Black people were not welcome at the Algonquin. And a gentleman from Baltimore came to vacation at the Algonquin with his Black chauffeur, whose name was Sidney. And Sidney, not being welcome, came to my grandparents' overnight cabins looking for a place to stay, and he was welcomed there. In fact, I believe he stayed there for the better part of 2 summers. Those were the days when people came to the Algonquin and stayed for long periods of time. So sometime during his stay, he was crossing the lawn one morning when my grandmother, Helen Merrill, was checking in 2 elderly ladies. And Sidney tipped his hat and said, "Good morning, Helen." One of the ladies turned to my grandmother and said, "Do you allow that Black man to call you by your first name?" And her response was, "Yes, he's my friend and he's a gentleman, and you may call me Mrs. Merrill." And I was just a little boy. And I can remember, kids say such things and they're innocent. Sidney smoked cigars. And I asked Sidney, "Would your skin not be so black if you didn't smoke cigars?" My parents were probably mortified when I asked them that.
You wouldn't remember Caddy, would you?
Oh, no, I'm just a little too young for that.
Just found another picture of him driving a slave for Harry Mallory.
My dad, Lester Holmes, was born in St Andrews. And interestingly, he died only 3 blocks from where he was born. We lived in various places, of course. We lived in the United States for a short time. But in fact, he died on the same street 4 blocks from where he was born in 1918. My mom was a little younger. She was born in 1924. I am assuming that they met through mutual friends or, at the hockey or skating rink. Who knows? Young people get together under various circumstances. My mom was raised on Reed Avenue, my dad downtown. And then in the 40s, that was considerable distance apart. Not so many people had cars. And we would hear my dad and some of his contemporaries speak of being an uptowner or a downtowner. And I guess if you lived west of King Street, you were an uptowner. And if you lived on the other side, you were a downtowner. Interesting interpretation of life in those times. Well, my dad did a number of things throughout his work life. One of the most interesting things he did, and interesting from our point of view as his sons, he had a job for around 5 years as a private chauffeur for a wealthy summer resident of St Andrews who wintered in Darien, Connecticut. So it was a great experience for two kids coming out of St Andrews in the 50s to move into a suburb of New York City. Although we were in the state of Connecticut, we were closer to New York City, we were closer to Manhattan than we are living in St Andrews to St. John. So 40-minute run and you were in downtown New York. And that made quite an impression on me. I'm not so sure it did my brother where he's younger, but I developed a kind of a passion for that area and New York in particular. And until COVID, I would try and get back there for a visit at least every couple of years. I love the city. I love getting to the shows and the nice dining places and so on and so forth. Getting my batteries charged. I wouldn't want to live there, but as they say, a great place to visit. When he passed away in 1972, he was only 54. Like so many people of his generation who were heavy smokers, he developed heart disease, and there was very little intervention at that time. Were he around today in the same circumstances, I'm sure he would have been a candidate for open heart surgery, but that simply wasn't available in New Brunswick at that time. And sadly, he passed away very suddenly. At that time, he was the custodian at the newly opened Sir James Dunn Academy. He had been there since its opening, which I believe was 66. I think the first graduating class was 67. I'll get slapped for that if I'm mistaken. And he worked in the hardware store on Water Street, where my brother Blaine currently works, which is interesting. And
but he spent his life here.
He did. Other than that few years we were away, he did a little stint in the armed forces, of course. Having been born in 1918, he was a candidate for the Second World War service, but he was discharged very early due to an injury in training. So he was never posted overseas or saw any action. He was a stalwart Legion member and supporter. He was a member of the Knights of Pythias Lodge. One time he was quite a faithful churchgoer at the All Saints, and good community person.
So you got his genes?
Well, no, I didn't get his medical genes, I hope, because I've already outlived him by a good deal. 50 years. No, not 50 years. It's 50 years since he died.
His community service genes.
Yes, in the community service. Well, and my mom was the same. And we'll just finish the Holmes side before I move on to her. We've talked about nicknames. My dad had the unusual nickname of Sticky. And I have no idea why. He inherited that nickname from his dad, who was also called Sticky Holmes. I think with my generation, I don't recall as many of my contemporaries having nicknames as the previous generations. When my parents talked about their friends, it was always by their nicknames. And my mom's neighbor was Stubby Thomas. Hugh Graham's dad was Skimpy, although he was a very big man. Yeah. Someone else who was very slim was called Beefy, and on it goes. My mom was Frances Madeline Merrill, and another case where she had a nickname. Number one, she never used the name Frances, and she rarely used the name Madeline. I think her parents always called her Madeline, but she was known to everyone as Maddie. She was Maddie Merrill, and then she was Maddie Holmes. And she grew up in her early days out on the Mowat farm with Miss Mowat, her godmother, and my grandfather worked for Helen Mowat and helped her establish Charlotte County Coachcraft. And he worked for her for many years.
And we have video of him.
Yes, we do. But even after he had his own family and owned his own home on Reed Avenue, 160 Reed Avenue, he still worked for Helen Mowat, I believe, part-time until just after the war, when the Ross brothers bought Cottagecraft. And grandfather went out on his own and started his own business on Douglas Street which was called St Andrews Woollen Limited. And so my mom was an only child, which was quite unusual in those days. I know less, unfortunately, about this side of the family, but there's some interesting tidbits. My mother, Maddie, was a Girl Guide leader for decades. And even when she was quite frail and not leaving the house, she would do testing for the Girl Guides. They would come in and get their badges, their badge tests done here, which she very much enjoyed. She enjoyed young people, and that connection to the Girl Guide Association was very valuable in her life, very, very important in her life. My mom was also a founding member of the St Andrews Beautification Committee, which later became the Business Improvement Area. She, I believe, was a founding member of the St Andrews Civic Trust and was certainly a supporter throughout her life. So both sides of my family, there was lots of community service. And of course, she and her mom and dad were pillars of the Charlotte County Cancer Society as well. She was affiliated with that for many years.
Where were you born?
I was born in the old Chipman Memorial Hospital in St. Stephen.
You were living
here in St. Andrews on Douglas Street. The first home my parents made together was on Douglas, and then they built a home on Balmoral Drive, just across from Tim Hortons. And we lived there until we moved to the States. And then when we came back, we lived in various places because they didn't own a home after that time. We rented.
And you went to school?
Well, here, started school in Prince Arthur School. Then in Darien, Connecticut, we went to Hindley School. And then I was bounced around all over that town because we were the first generation of baby boomers, and the schools were overwhelmed. So we were split up in neighborhoods, sort of. And one year, I recall we did half days. They were long half days, but it was the only way all the students could be accommodated while new schools were being constructed. It's quite interesting. And then came back here and went back into the public school system here, which I did not complete. I was a school dropout, but I did take a year and go to Fredericton Business College, which I'd had business training in the family business. I guess I had business instincts, but it was nice to get some fine tuning.
Where did you stay in Fredericton?
Well, I boarded with a widow on Squire Street. And I was very fortunate. I really lucked out. I got a private room with a private bath, a private entrance, and it was unlike a lot of places that my friends were staying, where they were crowded 2 and 3 in a room.
And you were what age then? This was when you were, what, 16, 17?
I was a little older than that because I had worked in the family business. So I was 19, I think.
So when did you leave school? 16.
After grade 9. In later years, a grandmother, Helen Merrill, came in to help grandfather at the woolen mill. He had a very serious accident in 1960, which resulted in his left hand being amputated just above the wrist. So he was, and it was an accident in the mill. It was in the processing plant where his hand got crushed and burned. And so grandmother turned some of the responsibilities of operating the cabins over to my mom, and she went in to help with the business side of the woolen mill and helping grandfather because we thought that he would be much less able to carry on, but he surprised all of us in how quickly he adapted to having lost his arm or his hand. He got a prosthesis and he was very proud of how he could use it. And there was very little around the woolen mill or the large property that they kept in Reed Avenue that he was unable to do.
When was that?
1960. And he worked until he was over 80. He died when he was 83, but he was still coming into the mill on pretty much daily basis until he did eventually get a bit frail and passed away in 1973 at the age of 83. My life with Ardeth, Ardeth and I met in the 70s, and we had sort of an on and off courtship for a number of years, and then we married in 1981. She and her family came from the Rolling Dam area. They were very, well, early settlers. They established themselves on their farm in Greenock, which is just a stone's throw from Rolling Dam Station, in 1886, I believe. And they came from Haverhill, Mass. So it was another case of people migrating from the States to New Brunswick. And several generations of her family lived on that farm up until her parents' generation. Her dad was Frederick Murchie Emerson, and her mom was Marjorie Thornton Emerson. And they were the last ones to farm the property, although they lived there until Marjorie passed and Murchie got very elderly. He lived to be 97, and he wasn't able to be on the farm the last few years. But that farm was in the family all of that time, and only recently Ardeth and her sister Janet sold the farm to a gentleman who has moved here from Ontario, and he's sort of homesteading it, which pleases them. Ardeth and her sister were very determined that it wouldn't be sold to be clear cut, because their dad had taken such good care of the woodlands. He practiced silviculture before the name was coined, and generations of their family lived off those lands without doing them any harm. They was sustainable forestry and sustainable farming. As we know, in the 60s, small farms could no longer, it was very difficult to sustain them any longer, and her dad went on to do other things. He was quite entrepreneurial. So Ardeth had kind of an idyllic upbringing on the farm. She started out going to a one-room school, and she moved to the school in Lawrence Station and then to St. Stephen. But her mom was a school teacher by profession and determined that the kids would have even a broader education than they could get in the school system. And she inundated them with books and learning. So Ardeth had a very broad educational upbringing, even though she didn't have a formal education. So in those times, many young women were directed either into the teaching profession or nursing, and her parents steered her toward the nursing career. She stayed in that career for only a matter of months. She excelled at everything she did, passed all of her exams, and then said, "I don't like this, I'm coming home." She just wasn't cut out for it. And so she went to work here in Andrews for Alan McGee at a very exclusive gift shop. It was called the Sea Captain's Loft. He also operated the gift shop at the Algonquin during that time, which she managed. And he was a great teacher, mentor to her, taught her bookkeeping systems and management methods and so on and so forth. And she learned a tremendous amount from Alan. He bought the Sea Captain's Loft from Hugh Plumstead. And I'm not sure if Hugh Plumstead originated it or there was a previous owner. He steered her toward thinking about opening her own shop, which she did later years. In the 80s, she had a store called Hollyhock and Vine. It was at 252 Water Street. It was a beautifully done shop. She had excellent taste in buying. And unfortunately, the market wasn't ready for it. She ran it for a few years and then decided to move on to other things. And then Ardeth came into my life, and she came with a background in community service and continued through our life together until her poor health caused her to retire from some of those things. But brought up in the farm in Greenock, she was a member of 4-H and the Red Cross Society, and she collected for the Children's Protestant Orphanage. And in high school in St. Stephen, she was a member of a number of high school associations, organizations. She was secretary treasurer of the St Andrews Civic Trust for several years. She was president of the business improvement area for a number of years. She was the first chair of the Van Horn Estate and Ministers Island, and she was a founding director of the Charlotte County Community Foundation. And all of this was done while she was either working full-time or operating her own business and helping me with my business and our rental properties and so on. So she had a full life of community service as well as our combined business interests. She was manager of the T.R. Meehan Foundation for a while. She would do jobs for me in the transportation business as required, although she didn't go in on a day-to-day basis. And of course, we bought a number of properties over the years, and she has a great eye for color and decorating and floor plans and so on and so forth. So her expertise as an accountant and her expertise in design and decor made a big contribution to some of the properties that we have rehabilitated. When I started in business in 1972, I had previously taken on the ambulance service. I started operating the ambulance service in 1969, and I was doing trucking and snow plowing and various things, and I had no base of operation. So that was another reason to acquire the big building across the street from Petrofina. It would make a great base of operation, and we would run a service station and garage. So we're doing all of these things. We were operating the ambulance service, we were doing trucking and towing and snow plowing and taxi service and delivering propane and collecting garbage and you name it, we were doing it. So we somehow came up with the name multi-service and of course my surname Holmes, so it became Holmes Multi-Service Limited. But as time passed, we thought that was a little awkward, a little clunky to be used as a promo name, so we just reduced it to HMS Transportation. My best memories are always when we're busy. And when we had a good team, which by and large we always did, and we were doing a lot of business, and maybe there'd just been a big convention at the Algonquin, and we had provided all of their ground transportation, and maybe we had done their destination management services and looked after their golf and their boats and their meals and their side trips, and everybody left happy. Those would be our best moments in the HMS building. But it was about the people. It wasn't about the building. It was what the people accomplished.
But many of those people involved did it as a community service. They weren't necessarily involved in the ambulance service, went on to have careers in the fire service and emergency medicine and other related services. So I go through the community and I'll think of someone who's presently working in the EMS industry and say to myself, oh my gosh, that guy worked with us in 1979 or 1983 and he's still in the industry, and some of the young ladies as well. So I get a lot of satisfaction from knowing that the little bit of introduction we gave them to that industry or profession resulted in careers for some of them.
I interviewed Geoffrey Holmes on the story of the iconic building on Water Street in St Andrews, most recently called HMS Transportation.
It was 46 years today I took possession of this building from Petrofina. I didn't own it for a couple of more years because I leased it for a short term. I believe it was 78 or 79 that I bought it.
course, the biggest change and adjustment in my life since we started this was Ardeth's passing in 2022. She'd had a long period of poor health, and eventually that took its toll, and she died from heart disease, which she had been treated for almost 30 years. So, big change in my life, which resulted in my selling our big house on Queen Street, the apartment at 246A Water Street, and I'm thoroughly comfortable where I am in my new surroundings. In 2024, I sold the HMS lot at 260 Water Street to John Rocca, a developer from St. John. He has recently opened an apartment and retail complex called Vonio. The building is attractive and offers 18 upscale apartments and 3 retail spaces. I'm really pleased to have played a role in bringing new life to the corner of Water and Princess Royal. The HMS building served our community on that site for 100 years, and I expect Vonio will serve it for the next 100 years.
We raise no children, Blaine has no children, so this will be the end of the family line in the immediate area, and we are the 7th generation.